Right, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to day 2 of the Future Leaders Climate Summit. I hope you all have been enjoying the experiences that you've been having. It was great seeing you all last night at dinner and getting to talk to a number of you. So we're just going to jump right into day 2 and kick it off with a plenary discussion on cutting through the green tape. The Energy and Environment Program's Executive Director, Greg Gershunny, will be leading the conversation today. Greg, prior to joining the Aspen Institute, Greg served as Associate Director and Chief of Staff for the U.S. Department of Energy, Office of Energy Policy. He also served in the White House for 5 years under President Barack Obama, where he was the Director of Energy and Environment for the Office of Presidential Personnel. Please join me in welcoming Greg Gershunny to the stage.
I would like to start by introducing my fellow panelists here. We have Reverend Lennox Yearwood, who is the head of the Hip Hop Caucus and also advises the Bloomberg Philanthropies. Many of you, or all of you, probably saw him last night in the New World Symphony in a fantastic session. So I just want to thank you for that.
Thank you.
We have Mayor Jon Mitchell from New Bedford, Massachusetts, joining us to talk about what cities and towns are doing on climate action. So welcome, Jon. And I shouldn't be welcoming Amy. Amy should be welcoming us. Amy Knowles is the Chief Resilience Officer for the city of Miami Beach. And so if you did the resilience tour, or if you've been walking around and seeing all the work that's happening around the city, that is all under Amy's purview. And so welcome, Amy, to your town.
And welcome all of you. Good formal welcome from me. Thank you.
The Energy and Environment Program at the Aspen Institute works to move people, organizations, and governments towards taking greater action on the climate crisis. And so we do that in a number of different ways. The Future Leaders Program is one of those things. And it's really about setting up the next generation of leaders in the climate change space to be even more successful than we have been previously. When I started in climate and energy, there was no training for climate policy because there was no climate policy. And so this is really intended to help develop the things for when it gets even harder than it is now, because it's going to get more difficult as we head down the road. And so this is really about all of you. I want to thank my colleagues Jade, Frankie, and Amy, who all worked on putting together the Future Leaders Program. And especially Nikki, who is the director of the Future Leaders, and you've been hearing from all week. She really just took this and turned it into this amazing thing. So I just want to thank all of them. So this session is about policy, and each of us come to policy from a different perspective. I worked in the White House and the Department of Energy and worked on policy at a federal level. Amy and Jon work at a city level. The Reverend works at a number of different levels on policy. And so the cutting through the green tape, it made me think of a story I once read, which is about red tape, which is, of course, how government operates. But it actually goes back to after the Civil War, when soldiers were trying to get their pensions, and the government officials actually had the pensions bound by actual red ribbon. And so to be able to get the money that the government owed you for your service, they actually had to cut the red tape off of your file to get there. And so when we have too much red tape, we can't get things done. And what we're seeing in climate policy is that there's so much red tape, there's so much bureaucracy in a lot of cases that it's really hard to get things done. So I want to start by turning to each of my colleagues here and have them talk about their work for a few minutes and the impacts of the process of climate policy in their community. So I want to start with Reverend Yearwood. And if you could touch on both the Hip Hop Caucus, but also from the philanthropic point of view.
Well, it's great to be here this morning. Good to see all of you again, or for the first time, depending on when I met you. My work, I guess I'll speak from three angles real quick. I think for me, I operate as both a doer, a donor, and a door opener. And those are my three lenses. And so from the doer standpoint, I'm also president of Caucus, and the goal there is building power with young people in particularly, but also people in disenfranchised communities. The thing that's important there is that a lot of times for them, policy is not seen as a central piece, even though it's critical. And so the idea there is let them understand that we have to shape policy. I think I mentioned before that we have to either shape policy or policy shapes us. And so the key thing there is, but then how do you do that? How do you get somebody engaged, particularly when if they have been engaged and they don't see policy makers as those who are for them. Now this is, for me, it's clearly nonpartisan. I also have the honor and the blessing of being a former U.S. Air Force officer, and I always use that from the standpoint that I never, when I was in the Air Force, I didn't sign up for a Democrat or Republican. I signed up to fight for Americans or to be there for Americans. And so for me, I think that during the climate crisis, that should be the same thing. So that's the one thing. So how do we get policy to our communities? Politics does a great job of using culture and their storytelling and media to do that. On the Bloomberg standpoint, I think that we have a wonderful campaign that actually invests in cities across the country, particularly. That's amazing that the Bloomberg Philanthropy actually feels that a lot of times if we just get focused on the federal level, which is critically important, particularly now as we're looking to make sure that the bipartisan infrastructure bill can really do what it needs to do, or hopefully and prayerfully, the Build Back Better policy process can get across the finish line. But without that, there's still a need to invest in cities. And so we have been investing, literally working with city mayors across the country and picking certain cities where we feel that we can do an investment, not only in those cities, but also with those mayors. Because a lot of times those mayors are really critical. They really have their feet on the ground in those communities. They can really talk to the communities. They can be with the communities in a way that's so very important. But the third part is, for me, is a door opener. And I think that's part of this issue of policy. It's for all of you, where you sit, either from the government standpoint or the private standpoint or the activist standpoint. The door opener standpoint is very important because what we have here now in regards to climate policy is that a lot of times people actually feel that this is over their head, and it's really not. It actually is, believe it or not, it's actually very easy when you talk about the ramifications of what can happen if you don't have clean air, clean water. And we see that in Flint. We see that obviously in my hometown, back in my home state of Louisiana, and throughout there with Cancer Alley. And so we see that about how policy can actually affect and take people's lives. And so I think here the thing that we have to have a conversation on is this. How do we, at this moment, understand the political moment that we're in? That is really a troubling moment for our country in many cases. When we're dealing with a crisis, that we have to educate and inform our communities, and at the same time broaden our movement, and ensure that we have true climate leadership. And this is the one that I just want to say, because I'm sitting next to the mayor, he's probably going to go next, and this is really all mayors in this process. Definitely, yeah. So I think the one thing we have to have, though, is that I think a lot of folks who are doing climate leadership, well, politicians, they have a tendency to talk about renewables on Monday, and then fracking or whatever on Wednesday. That's not climate leadership. And so we're really going to need to have true climate leadership if you're going to do a climate policy in a way that literally very similar to fighting for the women's rights or gay rights or civil rights in a way that it may literally put your career on the line in some cases. But the climate is just like that, where in a moment where policy will have made their situation where it may put you in a position where it may be career ending, but you will be life-giving to future generations. So,
thank you, Reverend. Mayor, do you want to jump in?
Yes, and thanks for having me. And so I would just start off by just saying a couple words about my city and then how I got to where I am, because it's directly relevant to to this discussion about climate. So New Bedford is a city of a little over 100,000, in a metro area of about 200,000. We are about 60 miles south of Boston, if you want to sort of orient yourself to where it is. It's an older industrial city in the Northeast, like so many others. We are proudly, probably best known for being the largest commercial fishing port in the United States, and we have a long history as a manufacturing center as well. And I came to the job, I've been in office for about 10 years now, and the reasons I ran for the job, multifold, but and they relate ultimately to the discussion around climate, and which has become even more relevant today. I ran because maybe this sounds very provincial, but home is where the heart is. I'm from there, and I, like a lot of folks who occupy positions like mine, feel very passionate about the place, and it's also a place that has struggled. We, like a number of cities in the Northeast and the Midwest, have watched, our homes, our cities where we're from, go decline as a result of the loss of manufacturing jobs and all that follows that, right? So declining tax bases, flight to the suburbs, all those things, and in many ways, I jumped into it because I wanted to sort of see whether we could defy the odds. And so it's not just my affinity for where I'm from, but also just sort of a challenge. And so that's my route. I had been a federal prosecutor, which meant that I had no background in anything I was about to do, which I learned the hard way after I got into it. But the one of the things that struck me right up front is as we talk about, you might say, well, why have you sort of going all in on climate mitigation and adaptation? And the reason is it's relevant to everybody, and sort of preaching to the choir in that way. But there is also this, and in an era in which so much capital and talent have flowed to the major metros in America, like Miami, like Boston, and New York, and so many others, all the superstar cities. There's a whole lot of the rest of America that's experiencing climate change differently, and in many cases much more acutely, but also it hasn't been part of the discussion. And so, for me, in developing programs around climate, around addressing climate, in some ways we had to sort of start the discussion just from ground zero. Whether by that I mean we had to find ways to make it relevant to people, but also urgent. We developed a climate action plan that we call NB Resilient, as in New Bedford Resilient, and it sort of lays out, like a lot of other climate action plans, lays out goals for net zero and a number of adaptation measures that we have to put in place and measurable results, and so targets and all that. But it's the way that we try to communicate the matter to folks that I think is really relevant and applicable to a lot of other places in the United States that are not in the thick of the discussion. So we made it relevant by bringing it right home. And we see climate in a number of ways. Arguably, first or most of the second most northern city on the eastern seaboard that is prone to coastal hurricanes, and we've experienced devastating hurricanes 3 times over the last century, and so it's all there for us. We see the sea levels rise in the fishing industry. We see things like fish that had been certain stocks of fish that had been a staple catch moved northward to colder waters. They're no longer around, and that's because the waters are getting warmer all the time. We see the threat of things like ocean acidification, right, to our cash crop, which is the scallop industry, right, that brings in billions of dollars into our port, and it won't take much, take too much of a drop in pH levels in the North Atlantic to threaten the livelihood of a whole lot of folks in that industry. So we try to bring it home to people in ways that are relevant to them. And because I think the discussion around climate change sometimes isn't nearly localized enough. It sometimes it is oftentimes very it's fairly abstract and technical. And what we've tried to do over time, and not just development policies, which have to be of necessity inclusive in every respect. They have to bring in people from every walk of life in our cities, but to make it relevant, to motivate people, the discussion has to be relatable. And so, what we've tried to do, and I'm the chair of the Energy Committee at the U.S. Conference of Mayors, in the discussion that we try to emphasize that, local action, which, on the matter of cutting through red tape and is best done at the local level. We can get a lot done. It's the old saying is that mayors get things done. Well, most mayors around the country live by that ethos. But we get a lot done not just because of the formal levers of power, but our ability to talk to people where they are, right? And I think that as we move forward in America's climate discussion, the global discussion, making it granular like that, it will be really important in building the consensus we need to confront this challenge.
Thank you. I think Tony Lazarovich touched on that last night when he talked about the 6 Americas and how relating it to how how it impacts people is really important. Amy, talk about your work right here in Miami Beach.
Well, first of all, good morning, everyone. I've been so excited to come to this session in particular, and I will tell you why. As CRO of Miami Beach, we are doing a lot of hiring, and I'm seeing a lot of resumes. And I can't tell you how impressed I am with the quality of resumes coming out of schools right now with professionals such as yourselves. It is shifting from this regulatory approach to this dynamic, innovative approach and a concrete understanding of these risks that we face. And so thank you to all of you. I hope you get amazing jobs out there. Come apply to places like Miami Beach because we have a lot of work to do. I'm in this field because everybody has their moment, I think, that they recall. But I was studying environmental policy in upstate New York, a very different environment. And I remember attending a session about sea level rise and just how at risk South Florida was. It kind of blew me away. And I swear not less than a month later, I met my now current husband from Miami. And I said, from Miami, that's crazy. You guys have sea level rise. And he was like, what are you talking about? No, we don't. What are you talking about? He goes, we do have hurricanes. But I had no idea. And so I said I would never, ever, ever live there. And here I am, quite a long time later. But I started my career as a regulator in Miami, and I'm so glad I did because I understand the systems in Miami, the environment in Miami, the infrastructure, and you have to understand that to be able to protect it. So for me, climate policy now is about climate resilience. Miami Beach is often referred to as ground zero for climate change. I hate that term, personally. I prefer to be called a living laboratory for climate change. You're here. You want to learn. You want to help us fix this. And all of this is scalable to other cities and to the rest of the country and internationally. Because we learn from other cities, we share with other cities, and that's just a really important part of this. So a lot of this for me is about resilience. So the term resilience is about bouncing back. It's about understanding the shocks and stresses that you face and being able to bounce back as quickly as possible. And my job as CRO is to look at everything from the policies to the plans to the regulations to the projects and make sure that we're incorporating addressing these shocks and stresses. And it's not easy. It's not a simple order. But we have done so much on Miami Beach that I'm really, really proud of. So if you haven't gotten to do a tour yet, we even have an app that will give a tour. My first day on the job here, I was driving through the city, saw Sunset Harbor. One side of the road was elevated about 2 feet, and the other side they hadn't done yet. And I was blown away. And it's why I came to work here, because it was a city not just talking about it, not just planning, but we had shovels in the ground. And again, it's not about the infrastructure, it's about the people, and it's about protecting people from a safety perspective. So the two sides of the coin, this resilience coin of protection, the other side being sustainability and doing all of the mitigation policies that we can in order to reduce that risk and in order to really slow it down. So that's some of what I do. I could probably talk forever about that, but I think having the appropriate policies in place, having the appropriate plans, and getting the shovels in the ground is really, really important. And when I say shovels, it's not just the infrastructure piece, it's solid urban design. We have and one of your colleagues in here, Juanita, good morning, actually works for me. She's a senior resilience analyst, and she comes from an architecture background and an urban planning background. I didn't want an engineer. I didn't want someone that had only studied policy. I wanted someone that had the ability to think differently about a city, to completely innovate a city, and imagine what this transition is going to look like and help kind of make it happen. And so it's a field that is very, very dynamic, and this is just part of what I do every day, and couldn't do it without people like you as well. We do have an amazing team. I have to say that team building is so important for building this capacity. I am so appreciative of all the advocates and activists we have out there because they're pushing the agenda. But somebody has to do the work in government. Someone has to put their head down and every day and say, what are we going to do? How are we going to fund this? How are we going to get this done? So that green tape that you talk about, it's a huge issue. Part of our green tape is dealing with regulations. Part of our green tape is figuring out how to communicate with our local community to help them understand the importance of these projects. Part of our green tape is working with our elected officials to try to help explain this because it's really hard and explain the urgency. NOAA just came out with a report saying that in about 30 years we'll see a foot of sea level rise. It's going to be more than that here. And we also have king tides that are about a foot higher than that. So those sort of seasonal tides that come in that we see and they go out, that is a glimpse of our future. That water's not going to go anywhere pretty soon. So we have to act now. And that urgency can be very, very hard for people. They're thinking, oh, it's 30 years. No, it's not simple to rebuild the infrastructure of the city and to do it well. So we have to start now. We have to elevate about 50% of our roads by 2050 to stay ahead of this water, to provide access to people's homes, to do it in a way that will protect our water quality, to add in new resilient trees that aren't going to be killed by the salt water that we see, to make sure we're adding in the mobility and the bike lanes because we are the most walkable city in Florida. You don't need a car here. Juanita doesn't have a car. It's fantastic. So how can we do more of that? And how can we build that in so that today it's a city we want to live in? You're here. You're sitting in a LEED silver building. Those fins across the front are shade structures designed to reduce the energy. If you walk along the back of this building, you have a beautiful living shoreline where we've actually pulled the flood sort of seawall up against the building so that you can enjoy a beautiful winding path against the water and it can all be flooded. We have done so much to make sure that, as we're still here, we're also being responsible and we're innovating. So, I could talk forever, but I probably went over. Thank you.
That was a lot of good points, and I think the point about people's backgrounds working in climate is that we need people from all different backgrounds and all different lenses to be able to solve the climate crisis. I think the Future Leaders Group is a very diverse group in terms of majors and jobs and focuses, and there's people working on energy, there's people working on oceans, there's people working on a local level, there's folks here that are working in international COP level. My undergraduate degree was on resolutions and wars, and I had no idea that would apply to climate change, but it turns out that social change is social change. I'll also make a plug for the Future Leaders Now, which is a weekly email we send out to all of our future leaders. I think there's almost 1,000 on the list, where we post jobs. So if you have jobs you want us to send out to all the future leaders, let us know. So I'm going to do a quick round of focused on what one policy, whether it's local, whether it's a state policy, whether it's a federal policy, would have the most positive impact in your community. Amy, I'm going to turn to you first.
Well, I'll answer your question, but then I'll say what I want to say. I think the most important policy decision we've made as a city is the decision to adapt to climate change. So cities have something called a comprehensive plan. They look kind of different in each city, but they have to comply with state law. And within our state plan, we have, throughout every single chapter, acknowledged how important resilience and sustainability is. We have said as a city, we are a climate adaptation action area. It's an official term designated by our state, and it was designed to be used by cities that have like certain areas, and it's supposed to give them special attention to focus on these areas and special funding. Well, our entire city is an adaptation action area, and what we have said is that we're not retreating, not now. We are incrementally adapting as long as we can, in accordance with the lifespan of our assets. And that's really critical because what it's led us to do is to create strategies and plans to hire some of the best global engineering and planning firms, to use the most recent and best science available, and to design the best we can through this. And so that's why, as we are prioritizing our neighborhoods and we're doing this work, we're looking at population density, we're looking at the quality of our infrastructure, we're looking at, we have a certain kind of order how we're doing this. That's not just flood risk, it takes into account other equity issues as well. So I think it's really important that, what is that decision? And that was made a few years ago. It was made on an emergency basis, and we had some really serious sunny day flooding. But now we're taking a much more careful approach. We're doing it more holistically. So I think that's the single most important one. And then the other thing I wanted to add, in addition to policy, is those networks. So we have the Southeast Florida Climate Change Compact. If you haven't heard of it, look it up. It's an amazing, amazing group. And it's just people like me. We come together every single month. We have a policy agenda. We educate elected officials. We have an amazing summit that's held every single year. I encourage all of you to go. And we just work on all sorts of policy issues. So, for example, I have the CRO of Monroe County, which is the south of us, it's the Keys, asking me, okay, as you're elevating roads, how are you tying into private property? Do you have a policy on that? How are you funding that? I will call somebody else and say, what is your policy on your EVs in your city? And how are you getting the charging stations in? So I just think those networks are incredibly important too, and are probably the most influential to progress. And that compact has been replicated across the state. It's been replicated across the country, and it's an agreement, just a formal signed agreement from 4 counties to work together to address the impacts of climate change. And that's led to so much work. We have local, regionalized sea level rise projections together. I mean, it's even better than what NOAA puts out. It's very, very defined for our region, and so we in turn can use that for planning. So I would say that's the other second thing.
Thank you. Mayor, what one policy would you like to see?
Yeah, my reaction sort of picks up on Amy's general point, which is if there's anything that I could ask for, it's more funding for adaptation, right? So it's not to say that I'm not optimistic about the overall mitigation effort here in the U.S. and around the world. Obviously, as we've been hearing throughout this week, we have to move with a sense of urgency, but we also know that the carbon dioxide in particular, but all the greenhouse gases that we've put up into the atmosphere already are not going to suddenly, dissipate, because we've undertaken all the mitigation efforts that we'd like to see implemented. The reality is that those gases will remain in the atmosphere, and that the things are already in motion, and so adaptation is, as you've seen here in Miami Beach, and as Amy has described, is really on the front burner for a lot of places. We don't. So the policy is we need more federal funding for things like seawalls and other measures to deal with the threat. We are not. We're a little more elevated, we're more elevated than Miami Beach. So we're not, looking at raising roadways, but we do have a real problem with storm surge. New Bedford has the great benefit of having what we understand to be the largest levee on the East Coast, which was built in response to Hurricane Carol, which hit New Bedford in 1954 and caused a great deal of devastation. So we have this hurricane barrier, as it's called, that protects the inner harbor and protects a number of neighborhoods, which is great, and it's become the envy in recent years of a lot of other cities. And but the federal government needs to get back into the business of building those things and building them, frankly, with a streamlined permitting process. NEPA and the Clean Water Act serve great, very important purposes, but we also know that the permitting process can slow things up, and we do need to act with urgency on that front. So I'd say that's one policy, right? Streamlining of federal permitting, but also federal funds are absolutely necessary, despite the investment that the federal government has made in the recent infrastructure legislation. We need a lot more.
We actually wrote a report on how to fix the permitting system, and we're working with bipartisan members of Congress right now to get that enacted, hopefully later this year. Reverend, what is the policy that you would most want to see?
I want to see the climate legislation as it was before earlier last year, because it's been watered down, on the federal level passed. And that's actually a hard and a sad question. I was, the other day I was in D.C., they had Emancipation Day in D.C., where they were celebrating 160 years of the ending of slavery in Washington, D.C. The slavery ended in Washington, D.C. before it ended around the country. And I was thinking about that, that wow, there are people who are literally like in their 80s and 90s who had their grandparents who were slaves. And that kind of blew me away when I thought about, wow, that wasn't that long ago, actually. And it just hits you in your heart when I think about, man, my great-great-grandparent was a slave. And that policy changed it so I could sit on the stage here next to a mayor from New Bedford, Massachusetts, in an amazing fashion. But that was a policy change, right? I see it as saddened because I'm wondering 160 years from now if Miami is underwater, or other parts of this country are underwater, if we have put all these things together and we didn't put policy in place. So on one hand, I know the policy, very straightforward on both the national level, on the federal level, on state level. On the other hand, I think back that will we actually put those policies in place that we have to, so that when we're no longer here and we're no longer occupying this space, and they will be thankful the way I am thankful for those who ended slavery. I wonder, and I hope that we are as courageous as they were, but I don't know. So, yeah, I can list up the policies, but will we actually put the policies in place?
That's a really good point. And, history is going to look back on our generation and, on what we did and certainly what we did not do. So we have about 11 minutes left, and I think I want to open it up to questions from all of you, because you've all been listening to a lot of people over the last couple days, and I had some great conversations with some of you at dinner last night, and so I want to hear what you have to think, and what questions you have for us. Anyone want to kick off? Right here, just wait for the microphone to come over.
Hi, my name is Sam. I'm a student at the University of Miami School of Law. I have a background in civil and environmental engineering from Berkeley. I have a question for Amy. So Miami-Dade County has 36, 38 different municipalities within it, and the county and the city regulations oftentimes conflict or are conflated. And while Miami Beach, I know, has been doing a lot of really great work forwarding the climate policy, not every municipality in the county has. How do you, as a city within a bigger system, combat that? I mean, especially when you're neighboring to cities that don't care as much.
So that's an excellent question. We have something called Resilient 305, and I'm not sure if you've heard of it, resilient305.com. And that started because the Rockefeller Foundation had this very special program to identify 100 cities to make them resilient cities. And we applied with Miami-Dade County and the city of Miami as a team to say, we're incredibly vulnerable and we need help. We have 34 cities. We have, you're close, we have, 2.7 million people. Half the county is run by the county, half is run by cities. It's super confusing. I'm glad I figured it out early on when I moved here. But it's a really interesting situation, and we're so diverse. You're sitting on Miami Beach, yet we have Homestead, and south of Homestead is one of the largest agricultural centers of our country. Like, we're like number 2 in distributing, plants for nurseries, and I mean, we just have this incredibly diverse county. So it's a very good point. I do work closely with Jim Murley, the Chief Resilience Officer for the county, and again, he has a fantastic team. They do newsletters, they do workshops, they're constantly reaching out to cities. But I think the biggest answer is that we are going to be a county in transition for a very long time. There are going to be people that are leaders in this area. There's going to be issues with funding and money. There's going to be issues with awareness. But I do think because there's such a focus now on climate resilience and addressing this issue, the mayors and the staff that maybe weren't having these conversations before, they absolutely are now. Because when we have a function, they're showing up. There's city managers, there's city planners, there's mayors that want to be a part, and they're leading in their own right, and we're always there to help them. We have a plastic-free Miami Beach program, really, really trying to reduce single-use plastics in our city. We've legislated away as much as we can. As you mentioned, there's conflict in a lot of laws. There's only so much we can do. But, we've banned single-use straws. We've banned single-use bags in certain areas where we can. And the county is actually copying that whole program, which is amazing. So they now are taking it countywide, and it started here. We have about 160 businesses signed up. But it's sort of like that's starting something small and then scaling it up. We have 2 composting sites for residents here. There's hardly any in the county. We don't have that at all. So we're trying to scale it up, and we're trying to get the county to look at that program. And they do a lot of things right. So I think the answer is there's no answer. These are complex issues, much like world peace, and we have to keep working on it. But I do feel really positive about our community wanting to move forward, and the awareness of these issues are so much greater. I'll give you one example. When we had the Resilient 305 launch, we invited all the mayors, and a lot of them came, and when they couldn't come, because some of these cities are really, really small, one city I remember sent their police chief. He's there, he's like, this is great, learning about it. I'm like, well, that's great, welcome. And we had this poster of the Resilient 305 plan, and we were going to have people sign it. And I thought, that is so corny. Who's going to want to sign that? And man, those mayors were lined up to sign it. They were so excited to put their signature on there. And we visited every single city in this county to tell them about the plan. And it was my favorite part of the planning process, because they were able to sort of pick which actions are most important to them. So great question, and that's kind of where we're at now.
And Mayor, can you jump in here, because you've been navigating building offshore wind, near New Bedford, and so how has that been kind of in that situation with all the other towns and cities and states around you?
Yeah, so the jurisdictional point is an important one, and you're getting at the same in your question, which is it's this, and Amy's exemplified it. You have to, even if the stars don't all align, you have to lead, right? And the broader discussion here is, about what we're doing primarily in the United States, the discussion in this conference, but, we all know that we're going to be every other country involved and all in on the effort. But you can't wait to, arrive at some grand agreement that cuts across jurisdictional barriers. You have to work on that, but you actually have to start leading by example. We've tried to do that in offshore wind. We in New Bedford consider ourselves to be evangelists of the offshore wind industry in the U.S. Because we saw it both as a climate mitigation strategy, but also a new industry that, again, for an older industrial city like ours, one that had great potential to grow jobs and to attract capital. So, just very briefly, offshore wind is a massive industry in Northern Europe, and now in China. In Northern Europe right now, there are some over 5,400 turbines turning in the North Sea. There are all of 5 or 7 now in the United States. So, and that's all about to change starting next year when the Vineyard Wind project deploys from the port of New Bedford. That'll be America's first offshore wind industrial scale offshore wind project, with many more to follow. About $70 billion in investment that is in the pipeline right now just for the East Coast, and it's coming to really every coastline in America eventually. But in starting off, it was, we couldn't do it alone. We had understood that the state had, as the regulator of utilities, as the states do around the country, had to play a role in creating the market for offshore wind. And then, of course, the federal government permits these facilities in federal waters. And so, long story short, what we try to do is to convince people that this is something for the United States. And we brought delegations of business folks over to Germany and the UK and Denmark so they could actually see with their own eyes how it all worked. And eventually we got state legislation that was favorable, that created the market. And then from there, other states started to do it. Now there's about to be this massive new industry in the United States that will be great for climate change, but also will create a whole lot of jobs.
Thank you. I saw another hand right here.
Hi, my name is Danielle Deisseroth. I work at Data for Progress. We're a think tank and advocacy firm in DC. My question builds upon the last one a little bit. Adaptation and mitigation requires a lot of building, and I would love to hear a little bit more about how you've successfully engaged with communities. I think this is most relevant to Amy and the mayor, but we've seen across the country a lot of pushback to certain developments or certain plans. It's always a little tough when things are happening like in your neck of the woods as compared to maybe somewhere else far away. So what are some, and also to Rev too, what are some successful ways that you can engage with communities on these building and your plans?
And let's do pretty short answer starting with Reverend. Especially I wanted to ask you about kind of post-Katrina and building community to build back and your experience there, and then we'll just come this way, and I think we'll probably be out of time for that.
Yeah, rapid fire. Just so one, encourage everybody to go to the Bloomberg Plenary website to look more at our cities program. And just to the last question, our cities program takes into account the regions. So obviously we realize that the city is also around counties and other areas, and so we encourage through that giving that they would all work together when that allows itself. That's one thing. In regards to literally the adaptation, resilience, and just the building process, that's a huge issue. Actually, one of the things in that, and I'll just speak to how we are informing the community, is that there is a lot of, adding another term to that, climate gentrification is also happening along those lines as well, and which public housing and other areas are being impacted and affected by resiliency or adaptation plans in those communities, in those cities, and so we want to protect those vulnerable communities as well. And so, particularly in cities like Norfolk, or even here in Miami, or other places around and around the country, we're recognizing that a lot of those communities are at risk. And so we actually are doing a documentary on that. So I just want to give you a plug on that. That is coming up. We actually are very fortunate. Dream Hampton, who did Surviving R. Kelly, they're producing that. And we have one of the sites who's amazing, doing the voiceover, and it's called Underwater Projects. Looks exactly at that issue you're talking about, and looks at how public housing in those communities are being impacted by literally resiliency and adaptation plans in those cities, and how the most vulnerable are impacted by those plans. So I'll stop there. We have some time.
Mayor?
Yeah, I'll just say briefly, maybe just offer up the work in offshore wind as an example of our approach to engagement, both in two ways. One is, especially in our Black and brown communities, making sure that job opportunities ultimately will be equitably distributed. And so, we've been working on job training programs that have formal structure in place. We're about to launch America's first offshore wind training institute the National Offshore Wind Institute. This is called NAWI. We've modeled it after some European institutes, similar European institutes, but the work of engagement is really important. You can build facilities and create job training programs, but if the opportunities aren't available to everybody, they will have failed. And so we have, through a number of community groups, as well as a number of really key ambassadors, begun the effort of pulling people in. It's not just enough just to post something on a board somewhere on the website and say, come get your job opportunity. We've had to really get to understand, not just get the word out, but actually implore people to think of themselves in particular positions. And then, there's been a whole lot of engagement that, in a sort of a separate vein, with the commercial fishing industry, to get them to understand that not only is offshore wind not an existential threat, but it's also it also may present opportunities for them to supplement their income as well through based off of the skills that they have. We have a great seafaring workforce, and they will be needed to help deploy offshore wind projects and to do maintenance as well. So, in a couple of ways we try to engage.
Thank you. Maybe last final word.
Sure, just final words are, and I'll sort of wrap up with how I started. Resilience is about people, not just infrastructure, and so that communication piece is so important. And I think it has to be a layered approach. You've got to have that steady drumbeat of, here's climate change, here's how it may impact us, here's what we're doing about it. And we have a great website for that, and BeRisingAbove.com. But then everybody wants to know what's happening down their street and how's it going to impact them. And so we basically had to surround our amazing engineers with a communications team. We created a neighborhood affairs division that really oversees that and makes sure there's good information, and there's websites and there's FAQs. And I think the hardest part is that we don't have all the answers. None of us really know what this is going to look like in the next 30 years. That's why climate change is so complex. And solutions for climate change always sort of bothered me, because it's like, how are we going to solve all of this? It's a lot. So that is, when we're thinking about community change, that's one of the hardest parts. So the best that we can do is say what we're doing, make the community a part of it, and keep kind of moving ahead. And the last thing is that, Miami Beach is, you're sitting in this beautiful big building. We have 14 historic districts that are also very beautiful, but there's a lot of naturally occurring affordable housing there. A lot of those buildings are really old. Not everybody has a huge mansion on Miami Beach on Star Island. So we are very cognizant of that. We're creating a private property adaptation program to incentivize action and to help fund some of that work in private properties. And we haven't seen any other city do this, with the exception of New Orleans. And we had wonderful conversations with New Orleans about it. They're focusing on green infrastructure, but we're looking at also flood mitigation and prioritizing those that are low to moderate income and not requiring them to have a competitive match. So we want to incentivize the action in a strategic way that helps those that need it the most.
Well, my old boss at the White House, John Holdren, famously said that we can do three things on climate change. We can mitigate, we can adapt, and we can suffer. And the more we do in the first two, the less we do in the third. So I want everyone to thank our speakers for their work and their words. Thank you.